More than 2,600 years ago, in a world without satellites, without global politics, without even a concept of modern nations, a man stood in exile and described a war that, even today, continues to unsettle historians, theologians, and geopolitical analysts alike. His name was Ezekiel. He was not a king. He was not a general. He was not a man with power. He was a displaced priest living among captives in a foreign land, watching his nation disappear from the map. Jerusalem had fallen. The temple had been destroyed. The people of Israel had been scattered, humiliated, and broken. From every human perspective, their story was over. Nations in the ancient world did not recover from that kind of collapse. They faded into history, absorbed by stronger empires remembered only in fragments. And yet, in that moment, when the idea of Israel as a nation seemed completely impossible, Ezekiel began to speak of restoration, not just survival, resurrection. He describes being carried into a valley, not a place of life, but a place of death. Bones lay everywhere, bleached, dry, scattered across the ground. There was no structure, no order, no hint that these remains had once belonged to a living people. Then a question is asked: can these bones live? It is a question that, in any rational sense, has only one answer. No, but Ezekiel does not answer with certainty. Instead, he says, "Only you know," and then he is told to speak. As he does, something impossible begins to happen. The bones start to move, they shift, they rattle, they come together. Pieces that had long been separated find each other again. Structure returns. Then tendons form. Flesh appears. Skin covers what was once lifeless. But they still do not move. They are complete, but not alive. Then breath enters them, and suddenly they stand. An entire army alive again. This is not presented as a mystery. The meaning is given directly. These bones represent the people of Israel, scattered among nations, cut off, without hope. And yet they will return. They will live again. They will stand once more in their own land. For centuries, this vision was understood in symbolic terms. A metaphor for spiritual renewal, perhaps. A poetic way of expressing hope after destruction. But then history took a turn that forced people to look at these words again. In the 20th century, after nearly 2,000 years of dispersion, the Jewish people re-established a nation. On May 14th, David Ben-Gurion stood before the world and declared the formation of the modern state of Israel. It was not a quiet moment. Within hours, neighboring nations invaded. The odds were overwhelming. The situation, by all strategic calculations, was unsustainable. And yet Israel survived. To many observers, especially those familiar with Ezekiel's writings, this looked less like coincidence and more like a moment where ancient text and modern history collided. A people once scattered across continents had returned to the exact land described in a prophecy written more than 2 millennia earlier. The bones had come together. The nation was standing. But Ezekiel's vision does not end there. Because after the restoration comes the invasion. He describes a future event, one that takes place when Israel is no longer scattered, but established, a time when the nation exists again, functioning, visible, and, in some sense, secure. And into that moment enters a figure known only as Gog, not a clearly identified king, not a name that appears elsewhere in historical records in any definitive way. Gog is presented as a leader, a commander, a figure of authority over a vast and diverse coalition. The land he rules is called Magog, and under his command are multiple groups, each identified by names that were familiar in the ancient world, but have since faded into obscurity. Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Beth Togarmah. For centuries, these names were little more than historical curiosities, fragments of ancient geography that no longer had clear equivalents. But as historical and linguistic research developed, scholars began attempting to trace these names to known regions. Persia, for example, is widely accepted as corresponding to modern-day Iran. That connection is one of the least debated. Other identifications are more complex. Some link Magog and related northern territories to areas that would now fall within Russia or surrounding regions. Gomer and Togarmah are often associated with parts of Turkey. Cush and Put have been connected to regions in Africa, including areas corresponding to Sudan and Libya. But it is important to understand something here. These are interpretations. They are not universally agreed upon. They are based on historical, linguistic, and geographical analysis, but they are still debated. And yet, what makes this prophecy so compelling to many is not just the names themselves, but the pattern they suggest. A coalition, a multinational force, a coordinated movement toward a single objective, and that objective is Israel. Ezekiel describes this force as coming from the far north. That phrase, simple as it sounds, has generated enormous discussion. To some, it points toward a specific geographical direction, north of Israel, beyond the immediate neighboring regions, extending into territories that today would include parts of Russia and Eastern Europe, even as far as Moscow. To others, it is less precise, a way of describing distant enemies, threats from beyond the known world. But regardless of how one interprets the exact geography, the image is clear. A powerful force, assembled from multiple regions, moving with intent, not randomly, not accidentally, but deliberately. If you're finding this kind of deep historical and prophetic analysis interesting, this is exactly what this channel is built for. You might want to subscribe now, because the deeper we go, the more these ancient texts start to intersect with the modern world in ways that are difficult to ignore. Ezekiel doesn't just describe who comes, he also describes why. The reason given is surprisingly practical. Plunder. The invading coalition is not described as acting purely out of ideology or hatred. They are coming to take something: wealth, resources, goods. For much of history, this detail seems strange. Israel was not known as a land rich in natural resources. It was strategically important, yes, but not economically irresistible. There was no obvious plunder that would justify a massive international invasion. But in recent decades, that perception has shifted. The discovery of significant natural gas reserves in the eastern Mediterranean transformed Israel's economic position. Fields like Leviathan have turned the country into an energy player in a region where energy defines power. Suddenly, the idea of wealth, of something worth taking, no longer seems so far-fetched. Still, it is essential to approach this carefully. It is easy to take modern developments and read them directly into ancient texts. Sometimes the connections are meaningful, other times they are coincidental. The challenge is knowing the difference. Ezekiel adds another layer to the story, one that is often overlooked. He describes other nations observing the invasion, not participating, not intervening, simply reacting. They question the motives of the attackers. They acknowledge what is happening, but they do not step in. This detail has sparked its own set of interpretations. Some see these observers as representing distant trading powers, possibly analogous to Western nations. Others see them as symbolic of global indifference. Whatever the case, the image is striking. A nation under threat, a coalition advancing, and the rest of the world watching. Then comes the turning point. The invasion reaches its peak. The forces gather. The situation appears from every human perspective to be decided. And then everything changes. Not gradually, not through strategy, but suddenly. Ezekiel describes a series of events that disrupt the invading forces in ways that defy conventional warfare. A massive earthquake shakes the land. Confusion spreads among the armies. Alliances break down. Forces begin to turn against each other. What started as a unified coalition collapses into chaos. The details are dramatic, even overwhelming. Natural forces, internal conflict, total breakdown. And in the end, the invading force is not victorious. It is destroyed. This outcome is not attributed to military brilliance or political maneuvering. It is presented as something beyond human control. And that is where interpretation becomes deeply personal. For some, this is a literal prediction of a future event. For others, it is symbolic, a narrative about the ultimate failure of overwhelming power when it turns toward destruction. And for many historians, it is a reflection of the fears and hopes of an ancient people, expressed through powerful imagery. What makes Ezekiel 38 so enduring is not that everyone agrees on what it means, it's that no one can completely dismiss it, because every generation looks at its own world, its own conflicts, its own alliances, its own tensions, and sees echoes, patterns, possibilities, and asks the same question: could this be it? As we look at global politics today, we see shifting alliances, rising tensions, and a world that feels increasingly uncertain. Nations cooperate in some areas while competing in others. Relationships that once seemed stable begin to change. But history has shown us something important. Alignments like these have appeared before, and they have disappeared, again and again. Which means that while it is tempting to draw straight lines between ancient prophecy and current events, those lines are rarely as simple as they seem, and yet the story remains. A vision written in exile, a nation brought back from dispersion, a future conflict described in striking detail, and an ending that leaves more questions than answers. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is for. Go ahead and subscribe, because these deep dives into history, prophecy, and global mysteries only get more intense from here. In the end, Ezekiel 38 is not just about war. It's about perspective, about how people in one era try to understand the future, and how people in another era look back and try to see themselves in it. It sits at the intersection of faith, history, and interpretation. And perhaps that's why it still matters. Because whether you see it as prophecy, symbolism, or history, it forces you to think about the past, about the present, and about what might still be ahead. And sometimes the most powerful questions are not the ones that give us answers, but the ones that refuse to go away.